Okay, so we are going to talk about this Parsha Ki Tisa, and it is um, probably one of the central Parshas besides Yitro and Mishpatim, which were major topics. The Parsha of Ki Tisa is major not only because of the golden calf, and that's a central issue, but there are two other important things that go on that we're going to discuss, and they're very heavy and very major. Um, and then next week and the week after, it goes back to the Mishkan. Remember the two previous parshiot that broke into this story with Moshe going up the mountain and the people uh, getting impatient and building the calf. Uh, that was broken by the Parshiot Truma and Tetzaveh, which are the instructions to Moshe of how to make the Mishkan and how to make the clothing, the costumes for the Kohanim. And then next week's two Parshas are going back to how the people actually did what it is uh, that God told Moshe to tell the people to do. So in other words, the first two parshas were to Moshe, the instructions of what to do, and the next two parshas that are coming up, VaYakhel and Pekudei, describe what the people actually did. And in a couple of weeks, when we meet again, we'll talk about that. Okay, so because this is a heavy parsha, I decided to start with a little frame that'll give you a little smile. Okay, now let's get down to business. Now this is where we left off in the end of Parsha of Mishpatim. That is 3 weeks ago. After Mishpatim, we have the very last few psukim that describe Moshe going up the mountain. So we're going to just look at the text and then we're going to analyze it. Vayemer Hashem Moshe, Alei Elai Hahara, come up to this mountain, and there I will give you these luchot, these tablets of stone that contain on them the Torah and the mitzvah that I have written to teach. So in other words, the Aseret HaDibrot, God said, I'm going to put on two tablets of stone, and that's what you'll have to give to the people to teach them. So Moshe and Yehoshua got up. They Vayal Moshe El Har Elohim. Moshe goes up. Yehoshua stays halfway down the mountain, and Moshe goes up to the mountain, and he says to the elders who represent the people, Shivu lanu bazeh, you guys all wait here, ad asher nashuv alechem, until I return. And Aaron and Hur will be with you down below the mountain. And if you have any questions while I'm gone, then go and ask them. So Moshe goes up the mountain, and then a cloud covers the mountain. Vayishkon kavod Hashem al Har Sinai, and the kavod Hashem, the glory of God, dwells on top of the mountain and the mountain is covered with a cloud for 6 days. So again, I have to picture this, where Moshe says to the people, wait for me, I'm going to get these tablets and I'll be down. But meanwhile, nothing happens. The people are waiting for 6 days. Moshe is waiting 6 days, and God does not call to him until Vayikra el Moshe bayom hashivi. But on the seventh day, God calls him from the top of the mountain. And then a very important pasuk, Umare kavod Hashem, and the appearance of God's glory, Ka'esh ochelet barosh hahar, is like a consuming fire on top of the mountain, and it adds le'enei b'nei Israel. The people saw this. The people saw that Moshe enters a cloud of fire on top of the mountain. Vayavo Moshe el betoch ha'anan. Moshe goes into this cloud, and he goes to the top of the mountain. And then the narrative statement, Moshe didn't say this. The narrative statement is Vayehi Moshe Bahar Arba'im Yom V'Arba'im Laila. That Moshe was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. In other words, the people don't know this. This is told to us, the reader, that he's on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights while God is teaching him all the instructions about the Mishkan. Okay. So now, after all this time, the people panic. Understandable. And now the story resumes after we read all of the instructions of the Mishkan and the garments of the Kohen. Then the story picks up where it left off at the end of Mishpatim. Vayar ha'am ki boshesh Moshe l'redet minahar. And the people saw that Moshe was a long time in coming down the mountain. In other words, he didn't come down for all of these weeks. We're talking about 7 weeks. The people are standing there and assuming that he's going to come down. And so they gathered around Aaron because remember, he said, if you have an issue, go to Aaron and Hur. I don't know. No one knows what happened to Hur. There's a lot of midrashim that try to come up with stories, but the Torah text focuses on Aaron. And they said to Aaron, come, make us a god who will go before us. For this man Moshe, who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what happened. Now, it says, make us Elohim. Kum aseh lanu Elohim asher yelchu lefaneim. Now, Elohim can mean a number of things. In its generic meaning, Elohim means a leader or a power. So when you say Elohim acherim, other gods, you're talking about what people see as nature powers. You know, the gods of the Canaanites and the Egyptians, the gods of the Nile, the gods of the sun, the gods of the moon, the gods of the stars, the gods of rain. These are all powers. So the term Elohim means a power that somehow leads people. So what they said, make us a God, an Elohim, who will go before us. Why? Because this man Moshe, who brought us up out of Egypt, people keep, again, remember we always said, the people always relate to Moshe as taking him from Egypt, not God. We don't know what has happened to him. The impulsive reaction of Aaron is to say to the people, take off all your gold jewelry from all your family and bring them to me. So all the people took everything and they brought it to Aaron. He put it into a casting fire and he shaped it in the shape of a calf. And then the people said, this is your leader, this is your God, this is your Elohim, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. So now we have to, a lot of the commentators have the question is, what did this calf represent that Aaron shaped? Okay, so another piece of very important information before we delve into that question. When Aaron saw, he built an altar in front of the calf, and he said, tomorrow there'll be a festival to God, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Tomorrow there'll be a festival to God. So the next day the people rose early, sacrificed offerings, and presented festive offerings to God. And after it, they sat down to eat and drink and got up and they indulged in revelry, dancing around this new leader in the shape of a calf. Okay, so here comes these questions, the traditional questions. What did the calf represent? So there are three theories that the commentators come up with. One is that the calf was a graven god. In other words, they made an image of God. Now, why would they do that? Because remember who we're talking about. It's the people who were raised as Egyptian slaves. Their parents were raised as Egyptian slaves, and their grandparents were raised as Egyptian slaves. In other words, there's at least 250 years that the Bnei Israel were enslaved. Some people say it was more than that. That was 410, but certainly 200 or over 200 years that people were enslaved. That's 3 generations minimally. So all they knew, God didn't appear to them in at all during this period of time. So all they knew was the Egyptian mode of relating to powers. And of course, they were Egyptian gods that they related to. So Moshe is gone. If Moshe is gone, then how are they supposed to relate? How are they supposed to have somebody to lead them in the desert? So what they did is to do what they would do in Egypt. They would take an image and they would call it the god and then hope that this god would lead them in the desert. That's one possibility. The second was that the calf was not God, was not meant to be God, but was a surrogate for Moshe as a leader. And there, the text seems to argue for this one much more strongly than the first one. We'll see. And then there's a third possibility. The third possibility that the calf was not God, was not meant to be God, was meant to be sort of a throne or a stool on which God's presence would be over. But it wasn't God, it was a a an an idolatrous image, and it's again, it's the Egyptian mentality that they knew that these Egyptian gods weren't the real God. It was that the real God was behind the graven image. So they felt that this image of a calf was not God himself, that would be number one, but rather was the throne of the God, that God's presence, the Jewish God, the God of the Hebrews, would be sitting on top of that, and we'll see where that idea came from. It's not so far off. Okay, so let's look at the first one. Was the calf an image of God? So the argument is that most likely it's not, because how is it possible that a people who heard God say, Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hotzeiticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, I am the one who brought you out of Egypt, don't make graven images. Don't make any gods to be with me. Don't make any gods of silver and gold. And the people, after they heard that, remember what the people said in Parshat Mishpatim? After they heard those statements that was in the Aseret HaDibrot, all the people declared, Naaseh, Kol Asher Diber Hashem Naaseh. We will obey and do everything that God said. So if they all said that, and they all heard that you can't make any kind of graven images, how could they go and dance around a graven image and say, this is your God Israel who brought you out of Egypt? It's like the idea of the calf being God, it just doesn't make sense in the context of even what the people understood and what the people knew. Okay. Take a look at the second possibility. The people continuously saw Moshe as the tangible representative of God. And you remember when we talked about Parshas Beshalach, all of those circumstances with the water and with the mun and with Amalek and all of those things, they kept seeing Moshe as the one who took them out of Egypt. They said, why did you take us out of Egypt, and why did you bring us here to die in the desert? Okay, these are the quotes that we learned from the previous episodes. They said to Moshe, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt?" They relate not to God, but to Moshe. We've said that all along. So the people grumbled against Moshe in another situation in chapter 24, and rather pasuk 24, and they say, "What are we supposed to drink?" In other words, they don't ask God; they ask Moshe. And the Bnei Israel said to them, "If only we had died by God's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all kinds of food that we want. But you, Moshe, have brought us out into this desert to starve the entire assembly to death." In other words, they attributed not only the Exodus, but they attributed their survival in the desert to Moshe. God doesn't play a role in here. So without Moshe, there would be no one to lead them in the desert, and they will all die of thirst and hunger as they wandered aimlessly in the desert. In other words, the entire focus of their survival in this desert was Moshe. And now Moshe is gone. Okay, so the idea that the calf was a Moshe surrogate has a lot of support for it. The people continuously saw Moshe as the tangible representative of God and attributed the Exodus and all of the miracles that happened, the water, the mun, everything that happened to them in the desert, they attributed to Moshe. When the people saw that Moshe was so long in coming down, and this is the people's reaction after 7 weeks, they gathered around Aaron and they said, now look at their words, "Come, make us a God," meaning a leader, "who will go before us," in other words, who will actually lead us and will follow. "For this man Moshe, who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him." In other words, we saw Moshe go into this fiery cloud about 7 weeks ago, and he's disappeared. We don't know what happened to him. And so without Moshe, there would be no one to lead them in the desert. There'll be no one to tell them where water was or to make water miraculously come from a rock. There would be nobody who would feed them. They would have the mun come down. They don't know if that would continue without Moshe. And certainly they would have no meat, the miracle of getting the quail that they had when they wanted meat. All of that would stop. So without Moshe, they would die in the desert as they wandered around because they don't know where they were going. So how are they supposed to find water? How are they supposed to find food? Okay, so that was the second theory, and that's the most likely theory. The first one we dismissed as saying they couldn't think that a calf was God. And now what about the third one? What's the basis for the possibility that the calf was not God, but was the bearer of God's presence? That is, God's presence would be above this calf, and God then would give the calf the ability to lead them through the desert, like Moshe. Now, you remember at the end of Mishpatim, there was a very unique experience. Moshe sent young men. They offered burnt offerings. This is on Har Sinai after the Aseret HaDibrot. Moshe, Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and 70 elders of Israel went up the mountain, and they saw, put it in quotes because they didn't see God, but they saw God's presence. And under his feet was something like a pavement of sapphires, like a stool or a throne. And and the image they saw was of feet on this stool. So they assumed that the God of Israel, who they couldn't see himself, but all they could see was like some feet in the bottom, was on this kind of throne. And so the concept that there is an object that has God's presence over it came from this experience that they actually had, or the leaders had. And in Yechezkel, of course, that's much later in history. But in later in history, he describes God's chariot, where God's presence is on a throne. So the idea that the people saw something that looked like a throne or a footstool and God's presence was above it gave them the idea that if they make a calf, what they're making is some tangible object, and then maybe God's presence would be on top of that. It's go ahead.
I think it reminds me of the Wizard of Oz, where the wizard was in front and he was talking to the people what they wanted, but behind the screen was all the contraptions, but there were no contraptions. There's only God behind the screen. It's so hard to visualize something
right. I think
invisible. You visualize something invisible, you can't do it. Invisible, visualize, just not, especially if that's the way their history was.
Right, it's true. It's a good example because it's like that curtain is something physical, and then you assume what's behind it. So they saw this calf, which is a physical thing, and they assumed what's on top of it. So yes, it's a similar kind of thing. But this idea of the golden calves was a very powerful idea, and it appears later in history. And I just bring this in just so that you should know it. Do you remember after Solomon's reign, after he died, the kingdom became divided into two. Yeravam, who was actually who the prophet said should take over from King Solomon, and he was not from King Solomon's family, but because King Solomon turned to, after in his old age, he turned to following the idols of his wives. God took away the leadership, the dynasty, and gave it to Yeravam, who was supposed to take over. But there was somebody from the dynasty of David, from Solomon's family, who said, "No, I'm the one who should take over." And so the king was divided. That Yehuda and Binyamin, the southern part, stayed under Yeracham, who is from the David dynasty, and the rest, the other 10 tribes, were in the north, above that, and they were under Yeravam. Now, Yeravam went off the derech as well, and it's described in Malachim Aleph that Yeravam said, "The kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David." He was afraid that the people, the 10 tribes that were under his leadership, would now return to the house of David, because that's where King David and King Solomon came from, and they would go back to Rechavam as the king. So he says, if these people go up and offer sacrifices at the temple, remember the only place you can offer sacrifices is in Yerushalayim, and Yerushalayim was under Rechavam, the king of Judah. So he thought, they'll kill me and they'll return to King Rechavam. So how is he going to create a situation where the people won't have to go to Jerusalem, won't have to go to the temple, which is under the kingdom of his competition, Rechavam, and they can worship up north. They can worship in his kingdom. So what did he do? After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. And he said to the people, the quote, It's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. You don't have to go. Here is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. Amazing. He used the same line that's in the Chumash. Here is your God who brought you out of Egypt. And he set one of the calves up in Beit El, which is to the southern part of his kingdom, and the other one he set up in Dan, which is all the way to the northern part of his kingdom. And he said, everybody who lives between these 2 points, which is the entire northern Israel, the 10 tribes, could worship at these 2 places. You can worship the place of the golden calf. And this, of course, became a sin because the people started to worship the golden calf. And the people went as far as Dan in the north to worship there, or to stay in the southern part in Beit El and worship there. But this idea of the golden calves being seen as holy representatives of God came back in history centuries later when the kingdom of Solomon was split. But okay, just a interesting historical event. Now, what's God's response to this making of this golden calf? Now, remember, Moshe is still on top of the mountain while all this is happening below. So God says to Moshe, who's still on the mountain, getting the Aseret HaDibrot on stone, Ki shichet amcha asher ha'elektam eretz Yisrael. Your people, God says it's your people, because that's what they say. Your people have corrupted themselves. Soru maher min haderech asher tzivitim. They have quickly turned away from the path, the right path that I have commanded them to go, and they have made a golden cast calf. Vayishtachavu, and they bow to it, and they offer sacrifices to it. Vayomru Eile Elohecha Yisrael Asher Eluchem Eretzrayim. This is your leader who brought you out of Egypt. So they turn the calf into a Moshe surrogate, who they then started offering offerings to. They corrupted the relationship between God and Moshe and started to worship the Moshe substitute as if he was a god. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Ra'iti et ha'am hazeh v'hinei am kshei orofeu. I see this people, and they are stubborn. In other words, they keep the same mentality of when they were slaves in Egypt. They have not changed, even after the event on Har Sinai, even after the Mishpatim, even after the Aseret HaDibra, after all of that, they still didn't change their mentality. And look what God says. Va'ata, and now, Hanichale, let me alone. Vayichar api bahem, and I will express my anger, my fiery anger against them. Va'achalem, and I will destroy this entire people. Ve'eseh otcha l'goy gadol, and you'll be the only survivor, and I'll make you a great nation. In other words, I'll get rid of all these people and make you a great nation. Now, what's interesting is how God said that to Moshe. He starts by saying, Hanichali, let me alone, and I'm going to destroy the people. What's the hint? There's a famous midrash that says there was a king whose son was being tutored, and the son and the tutor were in the study room, and the king became furious out at his son, and the king came up to the door of the room in which the two of them were and yelled into the room to the tutor, "Leave me alone, and I'm going to beat up my son for whatever he did." And the tutor got the hint when the king says, "Leave me alone, and I'm going to beat him to a pulp," that he didn't want me to leave him alone. The tutor said he wanted me to ask for forgiveness and to save his child. And that's the Medrash said the same thing is going on here. When God says to Moshe, You leave me alone and I'm going to destroy the people. It was a hint to Moshe that don't leave me alone. In other words, try to convince me otherwise. And Moshe becomes now a defense attorney. This Moshe could have just said, "Oh, please forgive them," just ask for mercy. But he doesn't. He stands up as a defense attorney and he presents three arguments. We'll take a look at the three arguments and see the power of such arguments that cannot be refuted. This is Moshe in his star role as a defense attorney for the nation Israel. So his first argument, he says, "Oh God," he says, "why should your anger burn against your people?" He said, "Don't call them my people." That's what they say. But really, we know, Moshe and God, we know the truth, that they're your people and you brought them out of Egypt with great power, mighty hand, with miracles. You forced them out of Egypt. Second argument is it was with evil intent that he brought the Egyptians. What are the Goyim going to say? The Egyptians are going to say that you, God, brought them out of Egypt with evil intent to kill them into the mountain, kill them in the mountains, and to wipe them off the face of the earth, which is what God wanted to do in his anger. And Moshe says, turn from your fierce anger. In other words, don't do that. Relent and don't bring disaster on your people. Remember, they're your people. And the third argument is, remember your servants, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and Yisrael, who you swore by your own self. God swore to each of them. If we went back and looked at the text, God swore to each, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, that he was going to make their descendants as numerous as the stars, and that he will give all these descendants the land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. In other words, you promised Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov that you're going to give the land to these people. If you destroy the people, then you broke your promise. And the response of God to hearing these three arguments was God relented and didn't bring on his people the destruction that he had threatened. Now the question is, why were these arguments so powerful and so irrefutable that God was forced to forgive the people and not kill them? So take a look. Defense argument number one. Moshe's logical argument is this. Despite the fact that the people mistakenly say that I, Moshe, took them out, the reality is, he says to God, you're the one who took them out. And you did it explicitly by force and miracles and wonders in order to create a nation from out of an impotent, ignorant slave populace that was duty bound to you. In other words, that was your plan. Your plan was to take them out as slaves and to turn them into a nation that was obligated to you. That was the covenant on Har Sinai. That was why you brought them out. So for 2 centuries, you made them a slave nation, at least 2 centuries, could be 3 centuries, developing a slave mentality which cannot think independently and cannot conceive of an invisible master of the universe. Thus, they have to relate to me, Moshe. This is all Moshe's argument. You force them to relate to me, a tangible authority, because that's all they knew. They were a slave nation brought up in Egypt that only related to idols. So you're the one who put them into Egypt. You're the one who enslaved them in Egypt for all these generations. So don't be surprised that they needed a tangible authority. Why are you so angry that out of understandable panic, they made a calf to protect and guide them in my absence? You made them weak and vulnerable, prone to immature and illusory dependence on tangible idols. In other words, It was your fault that you made them into a slave nation that were so immersed in the Egyptian idol culture that the first thing they do when they panic is to make some kind of a graven image because that's all they knew. So you can't blame them. You can't blame them for what they did. You're the one who put them in that situation. That's a very good argument. I mean, what is God going to say? I didn't put them in that situation. Of course he did. And so it's not fair that you should destroy the people who you made vulnerable by placing them for generations in Egyptian culture. Okay, defense argument number one. Argument number two, what are the Goyim going to say? What's Egypt going to say is that God took them out to destroy them. Moshe is appealing to God's fundamental reason for creating the nation from the initial covenant with Abraham. What was the purpose of creating the nation? They were supposed to not only have a special relationship with God, but they were to be a model nation. Remember, v'nivrechu v'cha kol mishpachot ha'adamah, he said to Abraham, I'm going to make them into a great nation. So through them, all the other nations are going to be blessed because they're going to become a model society that's going to have my laws of justice and compassion, and they're going to look at it and they're going to say, oh, these are wonderful laws and we want to be like that. That was your purpose of creating this people. So it's just this goal that would be frustrated by the destruction of the people. In other words, somewhat ironically, annihilation of the nation would be a Chilul Hashem. You're making your own Chilul Hashem. You're weakening your influence in society. Remember, we talked about what Chilul Hashem is. I'm not sure, we didn't go into it in detail, but a Chilul Hashem, Halal means weak, empty, insignificant. You're making God's influence insignificant because the nations are going to say, you see, this Israelite God can't even develop a small nation successfully, so why should we adopt his ways? Why should we see this nation as a model? So it's for God's own sake, says Moshe. God, it's for your own sake that you not destroy the nation, because your purposes of what you created this nation out of, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov's descendants, you created them to make a Kiddush Hashem, to make something that people will eventually follow. So now you're ruining your own plan. And as a matter of fact, later on in history, the prophet Yechezkel describes a situation which says exactly that. He describes a situation this is under a prophetic experience. He describes the Bnei Israel while they were in Egypt. He said, on that day, he's saying in God's name, on that day I raised my hand in an oath to them to bring them out of the land of Egypt into a land that I searched out for them, Zavat Chalav Udvash, flowing with milk and honey. He's quoting God as saying this while the Bnei Israel were in Egypt. Then I said to each of them, each of you throw away the abominations which are before your eyes, and don't defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord. Apparently, the Bnei Israel, understandably, the slaves, had idols in their house like everybody else did in Egypt, little idols. And God says, look, before I take you out, don't defile yourselves with these idols. Get rid of them. But they rebelled against me, says God. The Bnei Israel wouldn't obey me. They didn't cast away all the abominations which were in front of them. They didn't forsake the idols of Egypt. Then I said, I'm going to pour out my fury on them. Well, if they're not going to throw away the idols of Egypt, I'm not even going to take them out of Egypt. I am just going to punish them while they're in the midst of Egypt. So I'll forget the whole plan of taking them out. And then God says to himself, but then I acted for my name's sake, that it should not be profaned before the Gentiles among whom they were, in whose sight I had made myself known to them to bring them out of the land of Egypt. In other words, God said, I didn't bring them out because they deserved it. They were still worshiping idols and they wouldn't throw away these little idols. That's the level that they were in. But I have to take them out for my own purposes. My own purposes is so that the Mitzrayim and all the Canaanites and all of the other nations wouldn't say that God has no power over his own people, and there's no reason we should follow or listen to any of his new laws that he wants to promulgate. In other words, they wouldn't be a model nation. So, in other words, God himself, VaYakhel quoting God as saying, remember, even while you were in Egypt, you were going to destroy them for not throwing away idols because they couldn't help themselves. But then you decided, well, I'm doing it for my own Kiddush Hashem, my own name's sake, that it should not be profaned, that it should not be a Chilul Hashem, and all the Gentiles should now ignore the God of the Israelites. So I did it for myself. And this is exactly Moshe's argument. Moshe's second argument is you need this people. You need the people to fulfill your purpose of taking them out of Egypt and creating a model nation that eventually the other nations will be blessed through. And therefore, you need them and you can't destroy them. Then, argument number 3 is remember what you promised. You swore to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov that you're going to bring all of this nation, all of their descendants out and give them a land of their own, this Eretz Canaan. So Moses cannot consider God's offer. Remember, God's offer is, I'm going to destroy the people and make you, I'm going to start again with you. But Moshe says you can't do that because God, you already promised to all the descendants of Abraham, not just the tribe of Levi. Okay, it's true. I come from Levi, there's one tribe. But you can't pick one tribe and start all over again because you promised that all the sons, all their descendants, that's Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and all the 12 sons, they would all inherit the land, and you're bound by your oath. You swore to them you're going to bring all their descendants in, not just me, the tribe of Levi, and therefore you cannot destroy the people. These were the 3 very irrefutable arguments that Moshe made, and he sort of forced God to relent. And Vayinachem Hashem al hara asher diber lasot. So God then relented on everything that he said he was going to do. Now, what's Moshe's response? Moshe turned and went down the mountain. All of these 3 arguments, by the way, he gave immediately to God, who was about to destroy the people, and he was still on the mountain with God. So God then relents while Moshe was still on the mountain. But now Moshe has to go down the mountain and deal with the people. So he goes down the mountain. He has these 2 stone tablets with the Aseret HaDibrot in his hand. And then the Torah strangely describes them. They were inscribed on both sides, front and back, and they were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God. That actually God created, engraved, made the stone tablets and engraved himself, like with his own finger, as it were, the writing. I didn't chip them in with a hammer and chisel. God is the one who made the writing on these stones. So when Moshe, so that little detail is in there. It's an interesting question of why that detail is there. When Moshe approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, he became extremely angry. He threw down the tablets, breaking them into pieces at the foot of the mountain. So the questions, 2 big questions. Why, in the midst of this dramatic moment, does the Torah detail the miraculous nature of the stone tablets? If you go back to the end of the details in chapter 31, the beginning of this story, when Hashem finished speaking to Moshe on the mountain, he gave him 2 tablets of stone, the Aseret HaDibrot. The tablets were inscribed with the finger of God. That's what it said there. And we would expect the next sentence that we just read to be right there. That says the tablets were the work of God, the writing was the writing of God. That sentence belongs there, but it doesn't appear there. It appears here right as Moshe was bringing the two tablets of stone down the mountain. So why does it appear here and not in the normal place where you would expect it to appear? Second, it appears that Moshe threw down the tablets as an expression of his frustration and anger. But we learn in the Gemara that one who breaks vessels in anger is to be considered as if he worshipped idols. Why is that the case? And why would they say such a thing? I mean, why would you associate the two things? Because when you break something in anger, you're letting something else take over for you. Your anger takes over and determines your actions. That's what, if you worship idols, you allow the idol to take over and determine your actions. So anyone who acts out of uncontrollable anger is as if he worshipped idols. So the question is, has this patient, humble leader, Moshe, finally lost it? Has he lost control? And if it's about losing control out of anger, it may be similar to the striking of rock. Remember at the end when he struck the rock out of anger to the Bnei Israel, he was punished for that. And why, if he lost control and he broke the luchot, why wasn't he punished by God for breaking the luchot? So there has to be something else going on. Assuming that the destruction of the tablets was an intentional act, not an expression of uncontrolled anger, what was Moshe's motivation? Why couldn't he rebuke the nation and keep the luchot? It would make more sense. He would bring down the Aseret HaDibrot. He would say to the nation, you have broken what it says here. It says here, don't make any images of gold. Don't make any images even with me, even if it wasn't an image of God, but it was image associated with God. And you're not allowed to do that. Look what it says, right? He didn't do that. I mean, that's what he should have done. But rather, he just broke the tablets. So how do we explain that? It's an interesting explanation. It's not Hirsch's explanation, but an interesting one. At the sight of the people reveling around the golden calf, Moshe realized that the people still needed a tangible representation of leader, whether it was his own presence or that of a surrogate. In other words, regardless, the people still needed a tangible thing that they could see in front of them. If it wasn't Moshe, then it was a calf. Therefore, Moshe feared that the people will simply transfer their worship onto this miraculous tablet that he was carrying, written by the finger of God. In other words, the pasuk there describes the miraculous nature of the stone, that it was engraved by God himself. The people then were not ready to relate to an invisible God. We know that. And so Moshe didn't want to provide a tangible object that would continue to mislead them in their present state of vulnerability. In other words, he was afraid that since this was a miraculous stone, people would start worshiping the stone tablets, and they would become the substitute for God. So because of that fear, he knew his people, and he knew what they were not in a state in which they can really relate to God directly. So at this stage, the tablets would not serve a constructive educational purpose, but would actually continue to lead them astray in their distorted thinking. So he broke the tablets because they were miraculous, because God had made them, and he was afraid that they would now worship the tablets instead of worshiping God. Interesting answer, an interesting way to answer the questions. Okay, now the last thing we want to do is take a look here. Moshe says to Hashem, look, I'm frustrated, understandably so. You've given me the task of leading this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. In other words, you haven't really guided me so I'm successful. Apparently, I'm not successful. These people have not changed since they came out of Egypt. I have not been capable of turning them to worship you and to realize, to be grateful for what you did. I can't. I've been a failure. You have said He's saying to God, you have said about me, I know you by name, and you have found favor. In other words, God, you want me to be the leader. You have found favor with me, but I can't do this. Apparently, I'm not a successful leader. If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways so that I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people. In other words, it's not about me. It's about what's best for your nation. What's best for your nation is that you basically lead them, but you have to do it through me, but you have to teach me what I should do so I don't make mistakes and they end up the way they ended up here. So the term in Hebrew is Hareni na et dirachecha. Show me how I may know you and how I may lead the nations. Teach me your ways. God replies, my presence will go with you. Okay, I agree that I will be with you and I will teach you what to do and I'll relieve you of the burden so that you feel guilty that you're not an effective leader. I'll be with you. And Moshe, interestingly enough, he's brilliant here. Moshe says, no, not good enough. If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. And Moshe said, no, I don't accept your answer. Your answer is you and I are going to, your presence will go with me, but you won't show yourself to the people. It will be just through me. And he says, that's no good, because if your presence doesn't go with us, if it doesn't go with the people, then we're not moving from here. I'm having a sit down strike. We're not going to go from here unless you show that you are going with the people, not just with me. How will anyone know, Moshe continues, how will anyone know that you're pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us, unless you show yourself? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? In other words, it's not enough. It's just me and you. That was the whole thing that gives this distorted image that they need me and they can't relate to you. Moshe says that's a mistake. And look what it's created to this point, that they're worshiping me instead of worshiping you. So unless you show yourself amongst the people, then we're not moving from here. And that, remember, that's the whole purpose of the Mishkan. When you build a Mishkan, then the presence of God will be amongst the people. And that's what Moshe says. Look, you asked me to build a Mishkan so that you will dwell among the people. So you have to do that. Unless you're willing to do that, I'm not moving from here. And God says to Moshe, I will do everything you have asked because I'm pleased with you. Moshe, you're right, and I will do what you have asked. I am going to show myself to the people as well as to you. Then Moshe pushes, and he says, now, Hareini na et kvodecha. If you really want me to be an effective leader, show me your essence. In other words, show me how you think, not just show me what I should do. Hareini na et derachecha, show me your ways, is give me your plan. Tell me what I should do. Here he's asking for something more. He's saying, let me know why you do what you do. Then I can become a good leader because I can anticipate your wishes. And here God draws the red line. And he says, I will cause all of my goodness to pass in front of you. What I will show you is my characteristics, my name. Remember when God says, when Moshe says, tell me your name, what should I tell the people? What characteristics should I describe when I tell the people who you are? And God says, what I'm going to show you is I will have mercy on who I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Now listen to that answer. What is God going to show him? He's not going to show him how why he does what he does. When it comes to why he does what he does, God says, you know what? I'll never, you have no access to that. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I'll have compassion. But you can never figure it out. In other words, you will never anticipate me. You don't know what I will do. What I will do is what I will do, and you have no access to that. That's another way of saying is to Moshe. He says, "You cannot see my face. My face means my essence, to show you exactly who I am. No man may see me and live. No human being, including you, Moshe, can see my essence and live." Then he says, "There's a place near me where you may stand on a rock." So God says, come up to where you are and stand near my presence on a rock. And when my glory, my essence, passes by, I will put you in a cleft in a rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. This all is a metaphor. In other words, I'll sort of put my hand in front of your eyes because you can't see my essence. You can't see me. You can't see why I do what I do. But after I pass by, I will remove my hand. In other words, I will allow you to see, and what you can see is my back, but not my face. In other words, he's saying to Moshe, what you'll be able to see and what the information you'll be able to have is after the fact, is seeing my footsteps, seeing what I do, and you'll have to figure out to your best of your ability to understand why I did what I did. But you'll never know that beforehand. You'll only see history. You'll only see what I do, and you'll have to then interpret what I do. But you can never know why I do what I do. So eventually, forgiveness is obtained, and everybody's back in business. Okay, so what does this mean? This addresses the question of the Gemara interprets it as Tzadik viralo virasha betovlo. In other words, the eternal question of why is it that good people can get punished or bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people? How is that possible? You'll never know that, says God. That's seeing my face. That's seeing my effort. That you'll never know. Achon asher achon, richamti et asher arachem. I'll be gracious to whom I'm gracious. I'll be merciful to whom I'm merciful. And that's not your business. You'll never know that. But you can only see what I do. And so that's a very big philosophical addition. If we had um, a number of people on, we could have a discussion, but we'll have to leave it to another time. Those who are seeing this um, as a recording, just think about this issue, about us knowing about God only through history, only seeing the consequence and then trying to make sense of that consequence to try to figure out uh, to the best of our ability how we think God works and what's our responsibility. Okay, we will stop the recording here and we're going to meet in a couple weeks.